Hey everybody, welcome back to Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here, another Word Balloon Unconventional today to lead us into the weekend of San Diego Comic-Con. Two great guests. I think you're going to enjoy the conversation. First up, Nicky Wheeler Nicholson. You might recognize the last name. She is the granddaughter of Major Malcom Wheeler Nicholson, who was the creative founder of National Comics, which became DC Comics, and she has a great new book that talks about the prehistory of National Comics before Action Comics #1. Of course, we all know that was April 1938. We're celebrating Superman's 80th anniversary. But there were several years of National Comics that happened well before the debut of Superman, and this is the period that Nicky is covering regarding her grandfather's career and his comics. The book is called DC Comics Before Superman, Major Malcom Wheeler Nicholson's Pulp Comics, by the Major and, of course, Nicky. And this is great. The Major was quite an adventurer in his own right as part of the Army. He was also a foreign traveler. And Nicky goes into great detail about the Major's personal background and personal adventures. And then in the book itself, which is coming out from Hermes Press in September, you also get a great selection of the Major's own comics. He was the creative father behind Slam Bradley. Siegel and Schuster, of course, created Slam as far as actually writing and drawing the comic. But, the Major was the one who actually came up with the idea of Slam Bradley, and a host of other great heroes that are depicted in this book. It's fantastic, and really, if you love Golden Age comics, the Major story is pretty incredible. And there's a lot of apocryphal stories about the Major as well, as far as bad business acumen and bad business practices. And Nicky is here to set the record straight from her grandfather. Great memories and accounts of her grandfather are collected in this book, and she's terrific. So I think you're really going to enjoy part 1 of today's Word Balloon. You're going to enjoy part 2 as well. It's our buddy Rob Salkowitz who's back. Rob is the author of Comic-Con and the Business of Pop Culture. We've discussed his book in the past. He also writes columns weekly for Forbes magazine and ICV2, the wonderful comic book news website, and gives us great insight on the comic culture from a business standpoint. And he's on several panels this weekend at San Diego. He's also been writing lately about how museums are the new appreciation for comic book art, and how really, finally, comic book art is getting its due in a lot of respected museums across the country and really across the world. It's always been the case across the world, but it's nice to see that finally the United States is recognizing the importance and pleasure of exhibiting comic book art. Pretty neat stuff. We also talk about the business of comic book conventions. You know as well that the Seamus brothers, who used to run the Wizard World conventions, have come up with a new comic convention of sorts called Ace Comic Conventions, and Rob has enjoyed those firsthand and gives us a firsthand account. You know, I'm still skeptical, but he points out the good parts of it and the bad parts of it. I think he's pretty fair in what he says about what's going on in the convention culture as well. So really interesting stuff. And again, reflecting the kind of panels beyond the obvious that I always like to hunt down at some of the major conventions, and certainly San Diego is a good example of that. And you'll hear about what Nicky and Rob are doing this weekend. Let's enjoy another Word Balloon Unconventional and get things started with Nicky Wheeler Nicholson. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation about DC Comics Before Superman and her incredible grandfather, Major Malcom Wheeler Nicholson. Here's Nicky now on Word Balloon. Nicky Wheeler Nicholson, it's a pleasure. Welcome to Word Balloon.
Thank you. I really appreciate your doing this.
Oh, God, when I saw you at a San Diego panel, I want to say like 2 years ago, maybe 3, I was very excited about this project. And as you say, it's an untold chapter in the history of DC Comics, then National Comics. Well, and even your grandfather even predates the idea of National Comics. So this is really that untold period before Action Comics #1, very, very early years of comic book magazines.
Yes, and what a lot of people don't realize, because they don't have access to the comics themselves, what they don't realize is how much my grandfather had to do with the look of modern comics, with the stories, the formats, and certainly hiring many of the artists, the writers, the editors. And that's why I think it's really important for people to begin to see the work besides just talking about it.
Agreed. And that's
it is comics.
Well, yeah, you're right. And it's funny you say that, and here we are on an audio podcast talking about a visual medium. But I do agree. And it is great that you include a lot of the stories that your grandfather wrote and or was the the guiding creative force, and then handing off to other writers in some cases. Yeah, this is I always when I was a kid in the 70s, they had those Treasury Edition reprints of a lot of the very first appearances of Superman and Batman and the Justice Society and Wonder Woman. And it was just as interesting to me because these comics, like action and detective and sensational, they were all, and certainly fun, new fun and more fun that your grandfather even had a bigger hand in. They were anthologies. And it was like, well, wait a minute, who is this Dr. Occult? Who is this Slam Bradley? And some of these other features. So, yeah, it was really, I mean, it was like, you'd get like the first chapter of what was obviously a serialized story, and that's all you saw in these reprints. So it's like, oh, that's too bad. That sounds like an interesting concept. Where did it go after that?
Right. Well, the stories that we chose for this book were all originally pulp stories that my grandfather wrote.
Yep.
And one of the things I really have emphasized over and over is how important the pulps are to comics. Most people, when they think about pulps, they think of the 1950s paperback novels that have really funny, wonderful covers many instances. But pulps themselves were, as you probably know, adventure stories for the most part that started about sometime in the 1880s with, I think, the Argosy.
Sure.
And they were magazines that were all fiction, which is astounding to think about today.
Yeah.
There was very little advertising in them, and they were incredibly popular. And my grandfather wrote for a lot of those magazines, and the comics that we chose were originally pulp stories of his that became comics. And I thought that was a good way to show how important the pulps are.
Agreed. And also, we all know your grandfather as Major Malcom Wheeler Nicholson. And I love the fact that a lot of his adventure pulp stories were really based on his own experiences. I mean, this was a well-traveled, globe-trotting man through the military, and then I'm assuming as well after the military?
Yes, very much so. He and my grandmother lived in France just before the Depression. He was making enough money writing for pulps, believe it or not, for them to go they had an apartment in Paris. My grandmother was Swedish, and they had an apartment in Paris, and they rented this enormous chateau.
Wow.
In the Champagne district.
Wow.
And it was just an incredible lifestyle. And, of course, when the Depression hit, they had to come home and face what everybody else was facing. But for a couple of years there, it was pretty exciting. And he based some of his pulp stories on that chateau. And I got to visit there a few years ago with one of my Swedish relatives, the patriarch of the Swedish side, and it was absolutely astonishing to see that chateau and realize this was one of the inspirations for some of the stories that he wrote.
That's excellent. And, as you say, he was writing pulps in the late 20s before the stock market crash that led to the Depression. And this was the height of the pulps, and short stories and novels for these magazines, as you describe, which is pretty amazing. His Army career is pretty cool too, and I'm really glad that you covered that. And really the shame of his kind of being railroaded out of the service.
Yes, people who have repeated the stories about him have not really done their research, and it was used as one of the ways to put him down later, to denigrate him in a lot of ways by saying that he was cashiered out of the Army. But in the book, I talk about some of what happened. I don't go into full detail, which I will do in a full biography. But it was based on a racial incident because he was in charge of a troop of African-American Buffalo soldiers, and they were stationed in the Philippines, and his superior officer was very prejudiced. This was 1914,
wow.
15, yeah. And so you can imagine.
Sure.
And so his superior officer treated his troops really badly and was constantly throwing them in the guardhouse, constantly harassing them, really. And he just got fed up with it and decided that he would show his superior officer how good these men could be. And he challenged the superior officer to a contest between his men and the colonel's men. And it was for machine gun readiness. Now, in 1915, back in the day, what that meant was that these guys on horseback would have to be able to jump off their horses and put together a machine gun in a matter of moments in order to be battle ready.
Wow.
So, yeah, pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And so he trained these guys, and they had a contest in front of the big brass who came out, the generals with all their medals, and his men just beat the pants off of the colonel's men. And that did not sit well, and things escalated from there.
Wow.
So,
yeah, I'll let people read the book. And also really glad to hear, because I know you were planning to do this full biography of the Major, and I wasn't sure if this Hermes press release was, kind of a not compromise, but that the thought of doing the full biography morphed into this project. But I'm glad they're two separate projects, and glad that you're also going to have the full, even more details in your upcoming book about the Major.
Yes, I'm not sure if I'll do just a straight biography now, because I really enjoyed doing this book because it tells the Major's story through his creative work, which has always been the way in for me. And there's a lot more detail about his life and the amazing things he did, and so much more about the pulps and the comics. So I'm rethinking how I might do that now. But I'm definitely going to do at least one more book, if not more.
Terrific. Will you consider doing a collection of his pulp stories? Are they public domain now? Are they under copyright, so that's kind of not possible?
Surprisingly, this is interesting because it also has to do with Siegel and Schuster. In the pulps, the tradition was that most authors signed a contract or wrote on the back of a check that the rights to the author would revert back to them after first North American serial publication. And so my grandfather's stories all reverted back to him.
Wow.
However, there are people who own the copyright for the entire magazine. So out of courtesy to them, I usually ask for permission, but the stories all did revert back to him. And I have published a book through a small press of some of his pulp stories. It's called the Texas Siberia Trail, and it's published by a small publisher, John Locke of Off Trail Publications, and he did a beautiful job. Really, really nice job. He's a superb pulpster and a really good researcher, and he was the first publisher who really helped me. And so that book is actually available.
Oh, that's excellent. I know the one publisher, and they published the Shadow Pulps, among other pulp magazines. Street and Smith has morphed into...
Right.
I don't even... And you might know what the modern name of the company is, but I come from a sports radio background, and it's certainly from the 60s through the 90s, Street and Smith was a very big sports publisher doing season-long previews and postseason looks at all the major leagues. I mean, basketball, baseball, football, hockey. And they, at one point, bought this radio network that I worked for, Sporting News Radio, that was affiliated with the Sporting News magazine. And
really?
Yeah, and it was crazy. And again, being a comic book and pulp fan, I was like, at first I was like, oh, that's really cool. I'll be working for Street and Smith, the former Street and Smith. And then unfortunately they fired everybody and basically rebuilt the radio network in Los Angeles. So that's okay. I rebounded fine, and it makes for a nice story to tell my friends who are pulp fans and comic book fans. But so it is, and I'm not surprised to hear that a lot of this stuff still, these companies do exist under different conglomerates, and that, they held on to certain copyrights and everything. So, that is an interesting footnote. And I want to get into Siegel and Schuster, but first, so what do you believe led your grandfather to think these are great adventure stories, they would work as comics as well as pulp stories?
That's a hard question to answer without him having said it himself. Sure. So I can only make an educated guess. He comes from, my family has always been in publishing. His grandfather, my great-grandfather, right after the Civil War, began a newspaper in Jonesboro, Tennessee, in the eastern Tennessee after the Civil War. And his mother, that was my great-grandfather, and his mother, my great-grandmother, was a journalist at the turn of the last century.
Wow.
Which is highly unusual.
Absolutely. She was
a suffragette, which is why we have that hyphenated last name.
Oh, interesting.
Sure. I've always joked about it, and I just thought it was because my family was pretentious. But it turns out David Saunders, whom I don't know if you know David, but his dad, Norman, was a wonderful artist of the pulp.
Yes.
And David is an incredible pulp historian, particularly with the artist. And one day David said to me, well, don't you know the reason for that is because your grandmother was a suffragette? And I thought, oh, right.
That's cool.
So it was the idea back in the day that you kept your father's name and then you just hyphenated your husband's name. So that's why we have that weird last name.
That's excellent. No, that's great.
Yeah. So, he came out of this background of people who were journalists and writers and publishers, and he himself was an artist. He loved to draw, and some of his early drawings were in the yearbook from his military academy days. And I just think that was something that always appealed to him, that idea of the graphic representation. And because he was traveling in Europe a lot, he saw all kinds of pre-comic book things like, I don't know if you know Dr. John Lent, who's at Temple University in Philadelphia, but Dr. Lent has the International Journal of Comic Art, and we've talked at length about what my grandfather might have seen in Japan and Siberia and China around World War I, because those early Japanese, I can't call them comics, but they were pictorial representations, and Dr. Linton, I think he saw those.
Interesting.
And I think, it's just something about that combination of the written word and pictures just appealed to him. He'd had a syndicate back in the 20s, in 1925, 26, 27 in New York. And he was publishing representations of very well-known novels like Three Musketeers and Ivanhoe and some Edgar Allan Poe stories. So he was putting those in comic strip form for newspapers as early as the 20s, mid to late 20s. So clearly that idea was there from the very beginning. And I guess when they got back from Europe in 1930, and he just had such a hard time with struggling to make a living then. And why on earth he decided to start a comic book company in 1933, 34, at the height of the Depression, I don't know, but I'm glad he did.
Well, yeah, and it was, I guess, in the zeitgeist because you had people like, as Jim Steranko points out in your foreword of your book, Max Gaines, who was William Gaines, Mad Magazine's father, and in charge ultimately of All American Comics, which ultimately merged with National Comics. But, he was coming out with famous, was it Fabulous Funnies? Yes, I believe.
Famous
Funnies, thank you. Yeah, and this, and at first, the early comic books were reprints of newspaper strips. And then some entrepreneurial publishers, including your grandfather, instead are like, let's do original content instead. And obviously, and then the that's when the start of the golden age of comics really begins. And it's important to note this is a good 3 to 4 years before Action Comics #1 and Superman.
Right, exactly. I'm pretty sure, other than a few people, Tom Andre and I always talk about this, that my grandfather's really the person who began that. There were people who did, I think, had maybe one comic or something come out, but his company, National Periodicals, really, there's a total continuity there. So from 1934, when he began putting this together, until today, there's been total continuity. So that's pretty unusual. And also the guys like Max Gaines and people like Marvin Goodman and the Silver Clays, and these guys were all salesmen in the pulps. And my grandfather was the one person who came out of the pulps to get into comics who was a creative person,
sure,
a writer.
Yes.
So that was a big difference there.
Well, and because of that was, as you point out in your book, I don't know if sympathetic's the right word or just understanding as a creator himself. And it's funny that it took the efforts of people like Neil Adams and others in the 70s to do what your grandfather was doing back in the 30s, as you stated in terms of his pulp stories, that they would share revenue with the creators, or at least he proposed that. I know you talk about how that was the case with his early encounters with Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster.
Yeah, and that's not just something I made up. Those are in letters that he wrote to Jerry Siegel about how the rights belong to them and sharing of revenue, all that kind of thing was highly unusual for what happened afterwards, but not unusual in terms of my grandfather, who was an old-fashioned person in a lot of ways, doing something completely unusual. And he was doing it in an old-fashioned way with the handshake and the my word is good kind of thing. Sure. And in fact, one of my favorite stories about Shelley Mayer was that he complained at one point about my grandfather's contracts, which he said were something like, if I make any money, you make money. If I don't make any money, you don't make any money. And what I think is funny about that is that actually that's a hell of a lot better than what happened.
Sure, absolutely. Well, and again, this is being done in the early 30s in the throes of the Depression. And
right,
yeah,
exactly.
I mean, and your grandfather's really, well, and that's I'm assuming why he had to go to people like Harry Donenfeld and Jack Leibowitz to facilitate the publication of the books. So talk a little bit about Donenfeld and Leibowitz. They're names that are very famous, and in some cases, it's fair to say infamous, as being part of National and what became DC. And my God, Leibowitz, was with the company through, he was in his 90s and still with the company, right? Or 80s.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I think he pretty much ran the roost, as they say, for a very long time. I don't want to make them into villains because that's kind of cartoonish.
Sure.
We're talking about comics, but because they were real people. And I've always been fascinated by Donenfeld. I've been fascinated by him from day one. I know his grandson, who's also named Harry, who is quite fabulous.
What does he do now?
And he's an incredible photographer.
Interesting.
He lives in Hawaii, and if you Google him, oh my gosh, his photography is just stunning. And he happens to be, Laura Siegel and I met him for the first time, I think it was 2 years ago, and we both just fell in love with him. We just think he is fabulous. And I could see that that DNA of his grandfather, who must have been an incredibly charming person and really fun, and it made it much more human to me, and not so much thinking of him as a villain. And the other thing we have to recognize is that it was business. They saw a good opportunity. They saw that they were not going to be able to control my grandfather, and so they thought, okay, we'll see what we can do about that. And although it wasn't fair and it wasn't nice, this is what happens. And my grandfather would not want to be painted as a victim in any way whatsoever. So I do want to say that. The thing about Donenfeld and Leibowitz both that I think is important to understand is that they both came out of the Lower East Side. I lived on the Lower East Side years ago in New York City. And it's quite an interesting part of the city. It was originally landfill. So it had been kind of swampy, and so this is where the new immigrants were dumped.
Sure.
In this very unattractive landfill area, and it's hard to imagine, but it was crowded, really awful tenements. People who were fleeing terrible situations in Europe, and they were all jammed into this small space. And Harry had to go to work at when he was 15 years old. And for him to have come out of that background and achieve what he achieved, I think that's a really great story. And I'm hoping that his grandson, Harry, will follow through with that. He's been talking about it, and we've been encouraging him because it's a great story that needs to be told. Having said that, he was involved with bootleggers and gangsters and, you know, that kind of thing. And it's just interesting how all of that sort of came together. Leibowitz, on the other hand, was able to go to college. And he must have been an incredibly intelligent person, because you can tell from the way he put together the company and the way he strategized that he had really, really phenomenal intelligence and ability to strategize and see the larger picture of things. He was pretty cold from all the stories that have been told. He wasn't a very warm and fuzzy person. And neither he nor Harry saw the artists and the writers, the creators, the same way that my grandfather did. They just didn't. And so that was part of some of the conflict that occurred and has occurred throughout the history of D.C. Yeah. And I think, you know, one of the things that has been missing from the D.C. history and story is my grandfather's story, because without him, that creative impulse would really never have happened. I mean, I can't imagine that Donenfeld and Leibowitz would have been able to come up with the kind of creativity and to hire the people and recognize the artists that my grandfather did. He basically laid the groundwork for them, for everything that came after. Well, and that's what I think is important.
Agreed. And I know that prior to getting in business with your grandfather, these guys were making magazines, but they were kind of like the penthouse forums of their day. They were kind of these, like, smut. I mean, not smut. I guess that's too much, but they were kind of racy. You tell me, Nikki. Okay, you probably did more research.
Well,
I've never seen them.
They're really, the covers are quite something. Most of them were called things like Spicy Detective, you know, that kind of thing with the spicy in front of it. And then the covers would be these incredible covers with these scantily clad women being carried off by, you know, who knows what, space aliens, you know, just ridiculous.
Are they reminiscent? Are they reminiscent of, like, because I'm a big fan of and really appreciate the art of a lot of the men's adventure magazines of the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Exactly.
Okay, so it was like that kind of stuff. Okay, yeah, which is, again, pretty, or even as you were saying about the paperbacks of the 50s, a lot of these racy covers of scantily clad women about to be menaced by gangsters or aliens or mad scientists and the like.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But some incredible artists worked for Donenfeld. Norman Sanders was one of them.
Wow.
If people don't know his work, they should look it up.
Oh, God, yes. I have a lot of...
Really?
Yeah. Go on.
really, really wonderful artist. And so that's one of the reasons why people get confused about the pulp, because they assume that that was it. But there were hundreds of other magazine titles that were all PG and aimed for a general audience. So, yeah, they were publishing these magazines. And what happened specifically is that Harry was really pushing the envelope there. At the end of Prohibition, the reason Prohibition ended is that all the people who were teetotalers realized with the incredible violence that just kept escalating because of Prohibition and the gangsters running the speakeasies and the liquor and all of that just created this whole alternative business model, which ended up in a lot of violence for a lot of people, coupled with the Depression, lack of money, and all those kinds of things, generated this atmosphere. And so Donenfeld was publishing these spicy publications, and when Prohibition ended, one of the things that happened is that there was a crackdown on all kinds of things. And one of the things there was a crackdown on was these magazines. And so he and Leibowitz were looking for something else that would keep them out of trouble. In fact, there's the famous story about the guy, I can't remember his name now, Herbie, I think his name was Herbie Siegel, who took the rap for Donenfeld because of a spicy cover that basically is a naked woman with everything showing. So Herbie Siegel took the rap and I think spent some time in jail, and was seen at D.C. for years after that doing nothing.
Wow, but earning a check, I guess, for his trouble.
Yeah, exactly. So that was the big deal there, is that Leibowitz really wanted to get them out of this and into something that was PC, and they were printing my grandfather's comics, and he needed money, and there you go.
Wow. I love
it. Was not a match made in heaven.
Jeez. Well, and as you say, your grandfather's this creative force behind what National would end up, doing their early comics, and a lot of familiar names. Not only Siegel and Schuster, but like you mentioned, Sheldon Mayer, and Whitney Ellsworth, who I knew best, as I'm sure, and you explain it in the book as well. And listeners might recognize if they're paying attention to the credits on the George Reeves Superman Adventures of Superman television series. He was the liaison between DC Comics and really the de facto producer of the Superman TV show. So, and it really surprised me to learn 20 years earlier he's working at National, and it makes sense. But I assumed he was just a TV guy, didn't really knowing about his history in the comics with DC.
Oh yeah, so my grandfathers, that whole early group of people were really the foundation for, that's why I said, for basically everything that came after, including Bob Kane, who only worked for my grandfather a short period of time, but evidently he made fun of my grandfather in a comic that he called it The Little Major. I think that was it.
Wow.
And, people have mentioned this before, but I got to tell you, my grandfather would have thought that was funny.
Oh, that's...
he could have cared less.
That's cool.
He would have been highly amused by it and consider it somewhat flattering. And you have to remember that the thing about all of these guys, that my friend David Armstrong, who, by the way, is the hero of the hour here, David is, I've been calling him the curator because, I don't know what else you would say for the person who procured over 170 rare, scarce comics pages for this book. So he did a phenomenal job, David Armstrong, and he'll be at San Diego with me.
Terrific.
When we're, anyway, so David has some great stories about interviews he did with the guys like Craig Flisall and Ben Sullivan and Fred Gardner and many of these early guys. And what you have to remember is that these guys were really young when they were working for my grandfather. He was 40-ish, and I think Shelley Mayer was 18 when he was working for my grandfather.
Wow.
So you have to imagine that as an 18-year-old, how you might view someone in their 40s.
Sure.
And it's important to remember that when people repeat some of these stories from the past that these guys told, is that they were really young then.
Understood. Well, and again, yeah, these were, how do you say Craig's name? Craig Faisal?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he was, as you say, one of those very early DC artists, and was doing cover work for, your grandfather's stories, and truly, yeah, the comics that are in this book are fantastic, and it really is great to get a chance to really read. As I said, I mean, what I only saw of maybe 4 or 8 pages of a chapter of a story in, Detective Comics 27 or Action Comics #1 reprinted. You've got several issues, and you really get a sense of if in some cases complete stories, and in some cases as much as David, I guess, was able to uncover, but also to have the opportunity to interview these people. I hope that he says in the afterword, right, that he would like to do a film documentary. I'm hoping that we'll see this footage, because the only thing we got close to that was that public television comic book documentary, and thank God they had a chance to talk to Joe Kubert and Jerry Robinson and Joe Simon before they passed away. And so you got these guys who were all in their 80s and 90s and stuff, and able to speak before they passed. So it's great that he's got, some footage of these guys that even predate, the Simons and the Kuberts and that. And just like what you're describing, too, those guys were in their teen years when they entered the comic book business. It is really interesting how young all these guys were.
Yeah, and, Ramona Fagan.
Yes, love her.
Sort of gave a lecture, David, the last time we saw her about, getting that done, because it's really important. I mean, he's got some phenomenal footage of these guys from the early days. And we've been working towards a documentary and hoping that the more this kind of information gets out, that there'll be more interest in it. So,
I hope you guys maybe even crowdfund. And I would think that, you tell me.
I don't know yet. We're still working on it, and one of the things we wanted to see is what happens with this book and how people respond to it. And David also worked on a doc on Lily Renee that's going to be at San Diego this year. She was a very well-known artist who drew during the early days, and she's still alive. She's in her 90s. And so he just executive produced a doc on her that's going to be shown.
Oh, terrific.
At San Diego this year.
And of course, this is the year I'm not going to be there, and would love to see something like that. Honestly, Nicky, these are, and one of the reasons I'm happy to talk to you is, like I said, I've seen your past panels that you've been part of, and I really do, that is the great, I think, hidden secret of San Diego Comic-Con, in that, hey, everybody loves hearing about the new TV shows and films. It's exciting to see movie stars and television stars, and certainly that's kind of become the front page story of Comic-Con. But as you know, and as old-timers like me know, the comic history has not been forgotten at San Diego, and there are always these incredible screenings and panels, both academic and also just another, go to another panel room, and you're just learning about the history of comics from creators who are still around, but also these wonderful researchers, documentarians, and authors like yourself that are telling the real story. Because as you say, and one of the reasons why I know you want to get your grandfather's story out there, hearsay and just half-truths have kind of clouded the real story. And it really is that, I mean, we're so as evidenced by this podcast itself and video. I mean, it's like everything that's happening daily is being covered quite well nowadays. But I do think that, as you know, that pre-90s period of the 20th century, there's some holes, there's some gaps. And it's great to get as much real information out there. And that's why I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing and David's doing what he's doing.
Yeah, it's so crazy. I never in a million years thought I would be doing anything like this. But I've become one of those obsessive people, and I just absolutely love it. It's just one of the most rewarding things I can possibly think of, to work with some of the terrific people, and I love the older artists, and Trina Robbins and I are going to be doing a panel on Wonder Woman at San Diego this year.
Excellent.
We both wrote articles for John Lentz International Journal of Comic Art recently, on each of us on different aspects of Wonder Woman. My background, I have a master's degree in classical Greek mythology from a feminine standpoint.
Oh, wow.
So I love Wonder Woman.
Sure. Well, you're talking to a Greek guy, so I appreciate the history. Go on.
Yeah. So my take on Wonder Woman is about the Greek mythology aspect of it, which I just love. So yeah. I think you're right about Comic-Con. It's so funny to me. A lot of people complain about it. But my friend Kim Munson, who's a wonderful art historian, said there are many Comic-Cons that go on in the midst of Comic-Con.
Great.
And one of them is, as you said, the wonderful panels and films that are shown, and just the fact that those of us who are scattered across the country get a chance to get together and just talk and exchange ideas and come up with things. And it's really just it's exhausting, but I always look forward to it, and I come back completely energized and excited and with lots of new ideas for the future. So
Agreed.
I'm looking forward to it as usual.
Yeah, I'm kicking myself. I've gone the last 9 years, and I always call it expensive summer camp. Because it really is like, hey, we're here, and all my friends from out of town are here, and we're all hanging out for 5 days. And like you say, it's these one-of-a-kind panels. And you're right. I mean, and I yell back at the people who say, oh, Comic-Con isn't really Comic-Con anymore. It's about the movies. It's about the TV shows. And like you said, and like your friend said, no, there's a million subcategories going on, and it's what you want to make of it. If you want to spend the whole day in Hall H and sit with 5,000 people and see all the movie stars, sure, you can do that. Or you can go to these really amazing panels that, there might only be 50 people in the room, but it's going to be a really intense discussion about comic book history. And you guys all uncover these incredible stories that have kind of slipped through the cracks. And I love going to the academic panels, where the various other PhDs are kind of talking about a World War II comic book that was written in Japan, or post-war, I suppose, to kind of a propaganda comic to kind of normalize Japanese and American relations. And also, all of Will Eisner's stuff. I mean, the post-spirit stuff that he did for PS Magazine and things like that, and the various uses that comic books had. But, it's great. Right. But I want to get back to your book because, I love the creation. Your grandfather was kind of the creative godfather behind Slam Bradley. Am I correct?
Right. It was Slam Bradley was his idea.
That's awesome.
He came up with the idea, and he wrote a letter to Jerry Siegel and suggested Slam Bradley as a character, and he described the character and what he should look like and what he should wear and what kind of stories that he should have. And if some of the early drawings that Joe Shuster did of Slam Bradley look exactly like Superman and Clark Kent.
Sure do.
So, these ideas that my grandfather gave Siegel and Shuster, of course, Jerry Siegel just, took off with it.
Sure.
And one of the things I mention in the book is that Jerry created the sidekick, which to me is classic Jerry Siegel, the funny guy. Tom Andre and my friend Mel Gordon, who passed away this year, wrote a book about Funny Man.
Yes, go on about Funny Man.
The Siegel and Schuster character that they developed. And the sidekick for Slam Bradley has a very similar quality to what they developed in Funny Man. So it's you can tell what my grandfather's idea was and what was absolutely Jerry Siegel all the way. So that's kind of cool, too.
Absolutely. Did you ever read Darwin Cook's Slam Bradley stories that he and
oh, my gosh.
Oh, I'm glad. Go on, please.
oh, my gosh. I saw those in a French translation years ago on the Internet. And I am sorry to say I didn't know who the hell Darwin Cook was. Can you believe that?
Yeah,
I'm so sorry. And I saw this, and I thought, who is this guy? I love this. And finally, last year, J.L. Mast, I guess that's the way you pronounce his name, he's a French cartoonist, wonderful guy, young guy. He and I became friends, and I emailed him and I said, do you know what this is? This is so cool. Is this a French guy? He wrote back, thank goodness these guys are so kind to me about my lack of knowledge of anything past 1938. And he said, Nicky, this is Darwin Cook. And I looked him up and I just went crazy. And I was sick that I never knew him before he passed away. I mean, it just broke my heart. I mean, what a brilliant artist. And I absolutely love what he did with Slam Bradley.
Another guy, too, that wrote a lot of those Catwoman comics, Ed Brubaker, as well. I think both of them really... Dr. Occult, another early pre-Action Comics creation, I believe, or was in Action. I forget. Yes. You'll clarify. But whenever they show up in modern DC Universe stories, I really get excited because I know, as you say, a lot of these creations that were godfathered by your grandfather, they were the adventure heroes of the pre-Superman era and also the very early Superman era. And it's great, these plainclothes adventurers that, became as important or were important then, and I'm really glad were rediscovered by these modern creators. Ed is a wonderful, as you might already know, a great pulpy, inspired writer. And really, when you put Slam in his hands, he knows what he's doing with them. And yeah, it's great because he's got that kind of role in the DC universe as well as being an elder statesman adventurer that can still handle himself, even though these younger superheroes are around. And I love that. Yeah, I'm a huge Slam Bradley fan and also a huge Dr. Occult fan as well.
Yeah, really terrific.
That's
really terrific.
Yeah, I hope you get a chance to meet Ed sometime. I don't know if you've had a chance to contact Ed Brubaker.
No, I haven't, but I would really love to. If he's going to be in San Diego, I'll see if I can track him down.
Yeah, he's doing a lot of TV writing these days, and also doesn't work for DC or Marvel anymore. He does his own books through Image. And I wish I had more current contact information. I have trouble. He hasn't been on the show for a couple of years, and I know he's really busy with his television work. But he does still show up for signings at the Image booth at San Diego, and might even do the occasional panels and stuff. So if I were there, I would certainly try and put you in touch with him because, I think. Well,
I'll definitely look him up. And by the way, Danny Fingeroth and I are going to be at New York Comic Con in October.
Oh, great!
We're sharing a table in Artist Alley. So Danny and I have our own little vaudeville act that we do.
Danny's been on the show, and I'm a big fan of his writings as well. So no, that's great. And I'm 80% certain I'll be in New York. But go on.
Yeah, well, that'd be great. So we'll check in before then for sure.
Absolutely. No, Again, yeah, this is really a great book, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, and I want people to read the book as well. Obviously, it's from Hermes Press, and here I'm going to bring up on my Kindle the proper title. Let me scroll back. Here we go. So it's called DC Comics Before Superman: Major Malcom Wheeler Nicholson's Pulp Comics, and yeah, it's great book, and I love the collection. It has great, you could call them pre-Golden Age stories of the comics world, because technically, a lot of people say the Golden Age begins with Action Comics #1. And also you tell the Major side of the formation of Action, which again, his role had been diminished, I think, through the years. And I'm glad that he's got you as an advocate to say, wait a minute, the Major really had a big hand in Action Comics 1. In fact, and I want to say this, he was even interested in the Superman idea a few years before Action Comics, correct?
Right, exactly. I think he was one of the first publishers to see that drawing of Superman. And he was a champion of Superman from day one. Jerry Jerry was not comfortable with my grandfather's ability to get it out there because of the finances, and I can understand that. Laura Siegel and I've talked about this a lot, but my grandfather really believed in this character and encouraged it and encouraged him to move forward with it. So, yeah.
That's really cool. No, there's a lot of great information here for people that are curious. It's almost like all the people that turned down Superman, it's kind of like that classic story about the Beatles and Decca Records. And the executive at Decca Records telling the Beatles manager, Brian Epstein, guitars are on their way out. We're not interested. And, I know Will Eisner was one of the creatives that passed on Siegel and Schuster. I think they went to him as well, trying to get something going with Superman. So, no, it is really interesting. And as you say, the apocryphal story is that the idea for Superman came off Shelley Mayer or Vin Sullivan kind of looking through the slush pile and kind of stumbling on it and saying, "Oh, what's this? Oh, let's try this." And of course, that's not the trick. Right. That's not the case.
No, not at all. And Laura Siegel herself put the end to that story, as far as I'm concerned, because Laura is not just the daughter of Jerry and Joanne. She knows her comics. And she certainly knows her father's history. Her office is scary.
Oh, I bet. That's cool.
Really scary.
That's great. Well, and again, Siegel, not only in the creation of Superman, but even when he had to come back in the 50s as a writer and again, you mentioned Funny Men, the failure, unfortunately, that was a creation, if listeners don't know, of Siegel and Schuster's after Superman, and they tried really hard to kind of strike out on their own with Funny Man, and unfortunately, it obviously just didn't, take off with the public. But when he came back to DC in the 50s, he wrote so many classic Superman stories, despite having to kind of eat crow in coming back.
Right.
And that's the great thing. I mean, he really did love and understand this character in such a profound way. Well, and again, he's the co-creator. Of course he did. And also, thankfully, and never as much money as they deserved while they were still alive, but thankfully through Neil Adams and other outspoken advocates, they got their pension around the time of the Superman movie. And, that's a story in itself, obviously. But is she? Right. Is she? I know that and I don't mean to ask you to speak for Laura, but would you say that Laura is, for lack of a better word, content with the way things? I mean, I know they went back to court with the powers that be at Warner Brothers about. Yeah, and if you're not comfortable,
I really wouldn't want to comment for Laura. Laura can very well speak for herself. She had quite a great career herself as a newswoman, a journalist, as an actress early on. Oh, wow. She's a fabulous person. And she and her sons have been working on a documentary. And so they're going to come out with their take on it, and that's going to be really great when that happens.
Oh, that's terrific.
So,
if you could, I'd love to get in touch with her. And when she's ready to, and her sons, when they're ready, either with their project or willing to come on the record, I'd love to hear, their point of view on the whole thing.
Sure. I'm sure they'd be happy to do it. Her sons they're quite wonderful. They're both film students, and they're not students. They're young men, but they both studied film. And so I think this is going to be a terrific documentary, and they're working very hard on it. So that's good.
Excellent. Well, back to the book. Now you're going to be at San Diego, and you've kind of mentioned, if it's okay, I know they're starting to release the schedules of the Comic-Con panels, and my thought was, and I'll tell you this both on and off the record, if I wanted to release this around the time of Comic-Con, but if you want it out sooner, I'm happy to do that as well, our conversation. But yeah, my thought was to put it out
I think
a couple days before.
Around Comic-Con would be great.
Okay, great. So let people know, because I kind of see this almost as something they could listen to as people are heading to San Diego for Comic-Con. And I wanted to point out, I've got a couple other interviews that I'm going to release a couple days before Comic-Con to say, hey, if you're going there, come see these panels, come see these people. So yeah, if you don't mind spelling out your schedule as far as your panels at Comic-Con.
The panel on the book is Friday at 4 p.m., and I don't remember the room.
Oh, yeah, don't sweat the room.
I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, they'll look it up. That's okay.
But it's Friday at 4 p.m. and Michael Easlon, the executive producer of the Batman movies, he's going to be on it because Michael is a huge comic book historian and fan. And Trina Robbins is going to be on it. She'll talk about some of the women artists from that period, and me, of course, and David Armstrong, and it'll be moderated by Dan Herman, the publisher. And Dan usually does a really nice job with visuals for his panel, so there should be some nice visuals as well for people. And hopefully people will come and enjoy it, and we'll have some great conversations like we always do.
Excellent. That's your only panel then for Comic-Con?
No, I'm doing a panel on Wonder Woman also on Friday at 1 o'clock. Trina and Robbins and I will be talking about various aspects of Wonder Woman. And then I'll be signing at the Hermes booth Friday, Saturday, and Sunday.
Cool.
And there are special, there's an exclusive for Comic-Con of the book with added material, and some of them are signed by Jim Steranko, who did the foreword. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Steranko is a great pal, a really good friend, and I love him to pieces, and I was really, really happy that he did the foreword. He was absolutely the right person to do it.
A comic creator and comic historian in his own right, absolutely. And no, Jim, I know Jim on an acquaintance level, and he may not remember me initially, but then when I remind him, he of course, I love Brian Bendis calls him the Orson Welles of comics, and I think that's a really I kind of agree with him. Small body of work.
I sort of like to think of him as James Bond myself.
Oh, sure. Well, definitely. And I'm sure he would appreciate the comparison. Absolutely. No, he is Nick Fury. There's no question about that. And a great performer, both in his panels and God, his Twitter feed is ridiculously entertaining as well. And he's,
I know.
His incredible, colorful life. No, he's I love Jim. I think he's amazing. And yeah, I absolutely drink the Kool-Aid when it comes to Jim Steranko. I'm a huge fan.
Yeah, me too.
I'm with you.
Me too.
Absolutely.
I'm there.
Well, that's great. And so is the book coming out this month, or is it coming out in the fall? Or later this summer?
It's coming out in the fall. I think I will have copies sometime in August, but I think they're saying the official date is September.
Okay.
But so that's the scoop there. So the special edition for Comic-Con, and then generally available in September.
Outstanding. And Hermes Press, again, the publisher. And no, I agree. I'm sorry, his name again, the publisher?
Dan Herman.
Dan Herman. Yeah, I love when he does panels, and I've always been entertained by his panels as well, and appreciate his reproductions of comic history that he puts out through Hermes Press. This is great, and I'm like I said, I'm really happy for you, Nicky. I think it's a great book, and continued success, and looking forward to the next book as well. And I hope to see you in New York.
That'll be great.
Absolutely.
That'll be great.
So truly, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate your interest and enthusiasm. It means a lot. This has been a long time coming.
Yeah, and I'm glad it's finally happening and everything. And believe me, I understand. And no, congratulations. And yeah, can't recommend the book enough. And I'm sure the people that are coming to San Diego will look forward to meeting you and hearing more about your grandfather's incredible story. So thank you.
Thank you.
That's Nicky Wheeler Nicholson. Once again, DC Comics Before Superman is coming out in September. And as Nicky said, she will have copies of the book as well at New York Comic Con. She has pre-release copies available at San Diego. She's doing signings at the Hermes Press table at San Diego Comic Con. All right, let's get things going now with our buddy Rob Salkowitz. As I said, Rob is going to be talking about the business of pop culture as it's reflected at conventions like San Diego, other places. We also get into the Shamus Brothers' new conventions, the Ace Comic conventions. Rob tells us the good stuff about that and the bad stuff about that. Really interesting conversation, and I think you're going to enjoy it. Rob has a lot of theories of where comics and the geek culture is going in terms of how pop culture receives it, and we talk about that. A lot of his theories are in his book, The Comic-Con and the Business of Pop Culture, and it's a great discussion. I think you're going to enjoy it. So here's Rob Salkowitz on today's Word Balloon. Rob Salkowitz, welcome back to Word Balloon. I'm thrilled to talk to you, and I know you got a lot of San Diego plans, but like I told you off the air, I'm sad I'm not going to see you this year.
Yeah, sorry to miss you. Big week coming up, no doubt about it.
Well, I want to hear about your lineup of what you're going to be talking about. Should we? Yeah, let's. Should we start with that? Let's start with
Sure.
that.
So the range of stuff that I'm participating in the comics world is getting a little bit wider, which is great because I'm interested in all of it. But I started out as like the business guy, so I do a lot of stuff on the business side. But I got 4 panels coming up, and they're all on different things, and a couple of them are actually about comics, which is super cool. So if you happen to be in town on the Tuesday before the con starts, that's next Tuesday, the 17th, I'm actually doing a thing over at the public library, Seattle Public Library. They have every year the Bar Association of San Diego has a thing on comics and the law, and they invite a bunch of people that are in various aspects of it. So Batten Lash, the cartoonist, is going to be there. He does a comic strip about lawyers and supernatural and stuff like that. So
yes, supernatural law. Yeah, that's a classic. Absolutely.
And then I'm going to be there, and we're going to be talking about issues like creator rights and copyright and those sorts of things. So if you're trying to get into the business, those are kind of important things to know. Once the con itself gets started they got me first thing Thursday morning on a panel called How to Get Press Attention, which is a long-standing panel, and it's a mixture of people from press and people from sort of small independent publishers and stuff like that, talking about ways to get the big publications like Forbes, which I write for, to write about your independent comic. I try and write probably about 25% of my coverage is on non-big business stuff, even though it's a business publication. So there are ways to get your word out there, and so we're going to talk about that. That's on 10:30 on Thursday morning.
Cool.
Thursday afternoon is the one I'm really excited about. I don't know if you've talked about Full Bleed, the new IDW publication that they've been doing.
Absolutely, yes.
So I wrote
Dirk Wood's little project.
That's
Absolutely.
his baby, and I am absolutely honored to be among the contributors to that this time. I have a big piece on comics in galleries and museums, and I don't know if you guys get that in Chicago, but there's been more comic-themed shows coming to art museums, to pop culture museums. We have a big Marvel show out here in Seattle right now of original artwork and stuff like that. So it's really becoming a thing. So I'm doing a panel, and I've got Emil Ferris, who did, of course, the absolutely stunning Favorite Thing is Monsters book.
Chicago's very own Emil Ferris.
Absolutely, yeah. So she and I have been talking about this for a while, and a lot of that book takes place in the museum there in the Chicago Art Institute. Is that the? So she's going to be talking about that, and Nascenti, who's one of the guests of the convention, writer and editor, is going to be there. We've got Adam Smith, who's the guy who's just hired by Comic-Con to run their. So Comic-Con is starting their own comics and pop culture museum in San Diego, and that's going to be live in a couple of years. And the very first word about it that you're going to get will be at my panel with Adam is going to be there. And then we've got Kim Munson, who's got a book coming out on comics and museums called From Panels to Frames. So that's going to be the name of that panel is called Splashing Ink on Museum Walls.
That's really cool. You know that, and I know it's slightly different than the museum they're planning in San Diego, but I always love going through the sale room, excuse me. Is it sales or sale room upstairs?
The sale pavilion, yes.
The sale pavilion, yeah. And they always have a great art show there. And, you know, you always have wonderful pieces there on display. But as you say, I mean, I know being friends with Alex Ross and his art rep Sal Avenatti, that Alex has, a curated exhibit that, tours through a bunch of museums. And I know that they've done Kirby kind of exhibitions as well. So, no, it's about time that comic art really, gets the recognition it deserves. And as you were telling me off the air, I think last week when we were talking about doing this and stuff, it really has become a popular attraction for museums.
Well, one of the interesting things is they had a big show here in Seattle a couple of years ago, and it was like 500 years of illustration. So they have like Rembrandt and Goya and Picasso. I mean, it's like Mount Rushmore of Western art. And then the end of the show was Robert Crumb, and they had all the original pages from Genesis framed on the wall after you've already been through this incredible show. And I was thinking, this is amazing that any living artist is included in this company, much less a cartoonist. Now, words out about Crumb. I mean, people know that Crumb is, he's had big museum shows and stuff like that.
Sure.
But I talked to the curator at Seattle Art Museum, and she said, surprisingly, was not controversial for them at all to have Crumb as part of this show. They saw it as an opportunity to bring in people who may have never heard of Picasso.
Absolutely. Absolutely, man.
And
that's the thing. Get that audience in the museum and get them appreciating, the masters along with coming in to see a Jack Kirby piece or a Charles Schultz piece or a Crumb piece. Absolutely.
Yeah, and this show at Mopop here in Seattle with the Marvel stuff. It's the largest exhibit of superhero art and artifacts that's ever been mounted in North America, as far as I know, and it's blowing the doors off. It's their best-selling exhibit in their 20-year history, I think. So
that's excellent, man. I hope MoCA here in and I'm MoCA. Of course, that's New York, but Chicago's Museum of Contemporary Art does something similar, because they did a great Bowie exhibit and a great Rolling Stones exhibit in the last couple of years. So they're certainly into pop culture and appreciating the art of pop culture. And yeah, it would seem to me that comics is a no-brainer. So I hope that comes to Chicago. And as you say, obviously Emil Ferris and everything is, and her stuff, her works being inspired by the Art Institute. We had a Liechtenstein exhibit a few years ago, and I remember Fred Van Lente and Crystal Skillman being in town, and they came to Cake And after Cake, we all went to the Art Institute and went through the Liechtenstein stuff. So it's, and of course Liechtenstein has that complicated history with comics. So it's nice to see that the cartoonists are getting their due, and hopefully we'll get more of that in the future. That's excellent. What are the
time is nice for this. I mean, it's about time, and there's people like Emil and Bill Sienkiewicz and Alex Ross and some of these other folks that really, they have a claim to being the most relevant and interesting and exciting contemporary artists, never mind that they're cartoonists and illustrators and stuff like that. So it's a cool thing.
Well, and I talked to Sal Abenati, who reps both Bill and Alex, and too, the last couple years, Alex's booth at San Diego is definitely more of a gallery presentation. Yes. And last year they did the same thing with Bill, and they're doing the same thing again this year. I talked to Sal. He'll be coming up this same week as I'm doing these specific podcasts, talking to people like yourself, that these are the panels that I would be going to at San Diego. And this is kind of my unconventional. That's how I'm framing
I wanted to get Bill on the panel, and he says, no, I got to stay at the booth because they've set up this big fancy booth for me, and I got to sit there and draw and meet the public.
It's true. It's absolutely true. And he's great. And again, as you say, these guys are amazing, and it's so interesting, especially in the case. I mean, Alex has always kind of managed to attract people outside of comics and do these incredible pieces. He did the promotional poster for the Academy Awards a couple years ago, and he had those great. He had George Bush 43 as Dracula, kind of biting the neck of the Statue of Liberty. And Bill, Bill's been involved, a huge Bernie Sanders supporter, and has done a lot of work for the Sanders campaign, and also just beautiful work with Jimi Hendrix and a lot of other non-comic book kind of properties and people. And no, they're fine artists. They deserve their time.
Yeah, right. Bill has a piece in the Mopop show here. It's the promotional piece that he did for New Mutants back in the 80s, and we've probably all seen it. It's it's like the team, and there's like all this kind of cool decoration around the background. When you see the original, you see that he actually took circuit boards from computers and cut them up and like mounted them. That's not like him drawing a circuit board. That's a circuit board. And Annie Innocenti was the editor, and she said, this piece came in, and we were like, it's gorgeous, it's amazing, it's a game changer. How the hell are we going to print this thing?
That reminds me of Kirby in the 70s when he would kind of get involved with mixed media, and would cut out toy spaceships. And I remember that wonderful scene in Fantastic Four, the Galactus story, the first Galactus story, where Johnny comes upon Galactus's space station, and it's got to be a toy. I mean, if you go back and look, or those pictures of like the moon, and it was Orion, but it was a real photograph. Orion's like flying over a planet or a moon, and it's clearly a real NASA photograph and stuff. No, I love that stuff. And again, especially, you're talking about from the 80s and stuff. But yeah, that idea that, anything was handy. And it's certainly David Mack is in that realm as well. And I always love David's pieces as well. David's another guy who really has kind of expanded what comics art should be. As I'm sure you do, I love taking non-comic book people into a store today and pointing out the Dave McKeans and the David Macks and Sienkiewicz and all of these people. And it's like, no, this is comics. I mean, they're thinking, I always say, it's like they're thinking of High and Lois and Peanuts. And their minds are blown when they see really how great these graphic artists are.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. Well, I hope that the conversation at the convention goes half as well as this, because this is it seems to have touched everybody I raise the issue with is like super enthusiastic about it. I hope it's going to be a good conversation. And then plus Emil is and Annie are both guests at the convention this year. But people have not really gotten a look at Emil Ferris since the book came out. And she's a very interesting lady and's got a lot to say. So that's going to be fun.
Absolutely, man. Yes, so continue.
So on Saturday, this was kind of an oddball one that the folks from Fantagraphics reached out. And they want me to moderate a panel that they're doing on Saturday afternoon on comics anthologies. And they've got a whole bunch of terrific people on the panel. Carol Tyler and Manuel Fear and people like that are going to be on it. Eric Reynolds from Fantagraphics. So we're going to be looking at the history and current movement in alt comics anthologies.
Excellent. Wow. Will things like the benefit books that have come out in the last couple of years, people like us, or isn't it? That's the Vegas one, I believe. And I just had J.H. Williams and Will Tennis on to talk about that, or Where We Live. That's what it was called. And then Love is Love. I don't know if those qualify for specifically what you're talking about as far as the anthologies you're going to be
Honestly, for that one, your guess is as good as mine. I got to sit down and powwow with the Fantagraphics people. It was kind of it's a little bit of a stretch for me to be doing that, and I'm very interested in it. Of course, the Fantagraphics people are my homeboys here in Seattle, and I'm very interested in all the stuff that they're doing. So that'll be kind of an interesting conversation. And then on Sunday, I don't know how this plum landed in my lap, but Jason Lutz has been working on Berlin, this historical graphic novel, since the late 90s, and it's suddenly a very timely story, unfortunately. It's about the collapse of the Weimar Republic to German democracy and the rise of fascism in the early 30s, seen through the eyes of a bunch of unbelievably well-conceived and fully realized characters. So he hasn't exactly been, like clockwork on getting these out there. So it's been a long time coming. Book 3 is finally coming out at the end of in September. Jason's going to be a guest at the convention. I get to talk to him about this. I love the work. It's going to be a great privilege to he's going to be doing a presentation that's kind of a retrospective of his career, and I think I'm going to be moderating a Q&A. But anybody that's a fan of contemporary graphic literature, there's a lot to choose from at Comic-Con, as there is always. But I hope that gets a good turnout. It's Sunday at noon. Drawn and Quarterly is the publisher, and they're organizing it. But I hope people come to that, because it's a very interesting piece of work. Really interesting. It'll be really interesting to hear what he has to say about it.
Absolutely. And, again, all four of what the panels that you're doing, this is what I love about San Diego, because it really seems like only San Diego has all of these kinds of panels. And then, of course, you have the DC and Marvel panels, and you have the movie and television panels as well. But this is where I know I'm preaching to the choir, and by all means start singing along. But that it's so easy for people who don't go to San Diego to say it's just about the TV shows and the movies and Hall H. And that is what CNN, USA Today, and the major networks and news networks cover. But it's these kind of panels that really make San Diego still such a unique experience, and it can be just about comics if you wanted to.
Oh, absolutely. And I had a panel that I was pitching that I'm sorry I didn't get, that was on future of animation, and I had a whole bunch of really cool people that are involved in the sort of technology of animation and augmented reality and VR and all this cool stuff that were lined up for that, and didn't make it onto the calendar. And then I see from the program they have plenty of, if you're a fan of animation and that kind of stuff, there's lots of good stuff. I'm really looking forward to Venture Brothers myself.
Excellent. Oh, that's fantastic.
So
Jackson Public and the guys are going to be there. That's fantastic.
Doc Hammer. So I'm breaking some news about Venture Brothers on Monday. I have a piece going up on Forbes. I sat down and had a interesting conversation with them, and if you're a fan of that show, you may want to check it out. We're going to have an exclusive clip.
This is going to come out after Monday, so do you mind letting us know? And I swear to God, it'll be out after your thing is posted. We want to direct people to your piece.
Basically, it's an interview where I ask them about stuff that people want to know about, like, is there going to be a feature film, and why does it take so goddamn long for them to the season's out, but there's also going to be an exclusive clip. It probably won't be exclusive by the time people listen to it. But the new shows are dropping starting in first week of August.
Thank God, as we suffer through our Rick and Morty withdrawals. Thank God the Venture Brothers are back, and it's so funny because I just got into Rick and Morty halfway through the final season. I always name drop. Dan Slott's the guy's like, why aren't you watching this? It's amazing. And it is. It's so funny. And of course it crossed my mind. It's like, man, it's been a while since we had a new Venture Brothers series. And they pair up really nicely and everything. So thank God there's new episodes coming back in you say in the fall?
No, in August 5th.
Oh, in August. Shame on me. Okay, very cool.
So that's part of the news. I don't know if they had announced I don't know if they had announced the date yet, but that was so that's when it's going to be. And that at the panel at Comic-Con, they're going to have some preview episodes and stuff like that.
Wonderful.
So,
and that'll be on your Forbes. That'll be on your Forbes column.
Yeah, and then I've got a curtain raiser going up tomorrow, which is Friday for me. So that's an overall look at the programming and how the programming is decided. And I talked to David Glanzer. They have 2,200 hours of programming over the course of a weekend. From
Thursday through Sunday. Yes.
I counted up for the article 850 programs on the site, and now I just went back to refresh my memory, and I can see they've added a whole bunch of stuff. Like when I was counting them, it didn't have the movies or the gaming stuff or any of that stuff on there. It's probably well over 1,000 at this point, and that's just nuts. I mean, you think about a show like New York Comic Con, which is a great show, has plenty of programming, and I think they have 250 programs or something like that, and it feels like a lot. But this is, at San Diego, people spend all their time, sort of in the dealer's room or going to the activations or, like that kind of thing, or going to the big panels. Yes. There's so much going on there. It's very, very interesting.
Oh, sure. And through the years, I mean, got to see Jose Luis Garcia Lopez interviewed by Arnold Drake.
Oh, wow.
And before Arnold passed away. And one of a kind things like that. Or William oh, God, now I hope I'm saying his name right. An old Twilight Zone writer, William Clayton Thomas, I want to say.
William Clayton Johnson? I know who you mean.
William Clayton Johnson. Yes, exactly. Thank you. The guy he wrote the Kick the Can Twilight Zone episode. He wrote the first aired Star Trek episode, The Man Trap.
Yes.
Wrote the original story that became Ocean's 11. Co-wrote Logan's Run. And was, just on this little, 50-seat panel. And I got Andy Parks, the inker writer, and I'm like, Andy, we got it. I'm like, do you know who this guy is? He's like, no. And then I started rattling off his credits. He's like, oh, yeah, let's meet him. And after the panel, we got him outside of, in the hallway, and we just went up to him. And, God, he was, it was really one of the last times he was at San Diego, definitely in his late 80s or whatever. But he was so great to us, and we took a picture with him. And he's like, oh, boys, thank you very much for the interest. And we're both like, boys, we're in our mid-40s. But to him, we were boys. But it was great. And again, I got to see Ray Harryhausen and Ray Bradbury together before they passed away. And they were, fixtures at San Diego. And that's the thing. Max Collins always comes and I think flies under the general radar. And I love his writing, both in comics and his novels as well. There's just always this great opportunity to meet, especially if you're an uber nerd and these kinds of names. They're there.
Well, that's why you got to scroll through the program and look for the bold-faced names, because like any other convention, this was the amazing thing even in the early days when I first was going to Comic-Con in the late 90s, and the first year I went there, and I was looking at the announced guests, and it's like the Hernandez brothers and Scott McCloud and Kurt Busiek, and it was like good people, and I was like, okay, this is cool. Sure. Then I walk in the door, and there's like Neil Adams and Stan Lee and Will Eisner and Jim Steranko, and it's like, who has a Comic-Con that has all these people there, and they don't even bother to announce, oh yeah, they're going to be there, don't worry about that, or never mind all the celebrities and everything. Like I was going through, there's a really interesting panel on Afrofuturism that's sometime, I think it's on Saturday afternoon or something like that. Nichelle Nichols is on the panel.
Oh, that's great.
Right? I mean,
man,
talk about authoritative.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. There's the person that's been there from the beginning and can really tell you where things are going and everything. And I keep lucking out and having those kinds of people that are older and have that perspective of being pioneers like Nichelle is, and can also speak with clarity and compare what's going on today with the struggles of what she went through back in the 60s and everything. And that's fantastic to be able to hear from people like that.
And it's great that that she's still out and seeing the fans and stuff like that. I mean, these people are not going to be with us forever. And if you want to see them and hear what they have to say or express your appreciation, now's the time. One other thing I got to plug is if you're a fan of Nichelle Nichols and some of the Eisner Awards on Friday night has an all-star line of presenters, some of whom have been announced and some of whom are still secret. And, people kind of, Friday night, people have their own plans and stuff like that. Eisner Awards definitely something you should put on your calendar. I'm saying that my wife is a volunteer on the Eisner Awards, and she's involved with it, and so she's seen the full lineup, and I can tell you that's plus you get to see the best work of the year honored, and a lot of the creators are there too. So
absolutely, I was there last year as a guest of Tom King, and we had a great time. And immediately afterwards, everyone adjourns to really what is the lobby of the, in front of the room that they have the Eisners in. And everyone really just hangs out and has like a round or two of drinks before they wrap up the night. And that's when Warren and Louise Simonson, or Walter and Louise Simonson were available. And Dave Gibbons, I got, I'm hanging with him for 10 minutes. And in years past, that's when I met Frank Miller. And that's when they are their most accessible, because they're just chilling and saying hi to everybody. And you're absolutely right. It's a great opportunity to. It's a fun event. Bill Morrison always does a great job emceeing, and he's really funny. And he's of The Simpsons and Futurama and Bongo Comics, and certainly Mad.
I was going to say editor
of
Mad Magazine now, right?
Yes, the current editor of Mad. So he really is a very entertaining guy, and he is of the community. So it's great that he really, can do both. And yes, always amazing surprise celebrity guests. Wayne Brady and Greg Grunberg among celebrities that I can think of off the top of my head that were there last year. And also, it seemed like last year they finally, because it's a long awards presentation, but I thought last year they did a really good job of keeping things moving.
They do.
And it's a great cross section too of mainstream and also alternative comics, and they're all celebrated at the Eisner.
And they do have a bar in the back.
This is true.
But based on the names that I have seen there are people that are going to be at the Eisner Awards that you would line up around the building to see. So just a word to the wise if this goes out in time for that. If not, then you'll have read the news by the time it happens. But it's a very interesting evening. The post-Eisner party, since you mentioned it, is the site of my first and still one of my best all-time things that ever happened to me at San Diego. This is the first year I went down there. Was just a fan. Didn't know anybody. Was there by myself because my wife was like, she wasn't so sure about it back then. So I'm hanging out at the Eisner after party, 1997. And it's at the Hyatt. I went upstairs. I didn't know anybody. I'm just kind of milling around. I walk upstairs, and there's these guys playing cards at this table in the back. And sitting at the table is Scott McCloud, Kurt Busiek, Steve Bissette, and Will Eisner.
Oh, that's great.
And they're playing five-card Nancy, which is this nutty game that Cloud invented where they cut out panels from the Nancy strip and you sort of play them like Go Fish. It's like you put one down and then everybody votes up or down whether the sort of story makes sense. So I'm sitting there watching. I'm like, what the hell are you playing? And they explained the rules to me, and they said, we'll deal you in. So here I am sitting at this thing. And then, of course, Will Eisner plays a card. And what am I going to say? Like, sorry, Will, you got to pick that card up because your storytelling is, isn't really doing it on this one. Like, I don't know. It was surreal. And from then on, that's when I was hooked. That was like.
That's fantastic. My first Eisners, that is when I met Frank Miller. And this was 2006, so podcasting was still relatively new. And I'm like, oh, Frank, I'd love to have you on the podcast. He's like, oh, yeah, sure, give me a card. And I was out of cards. I'm like, I don't have a card. And he shrugged and walked away in classic Frank Miller fashion. And I'm like, no, come back. Shane, come back. So it was tough. I want to point out another thing, that you really should comb the main floor, because every now and then they will have celebrities available for signings at random booths. And that's how I met Richard Anderson, Oscar Goldman from The $6 Million Man and The Bionic Woman. And that's the only thing he was doing that weekend. And there was no line. And I walked up and had a lovely 10-minute conversation. And being a movie nerd, I know he was one of those guys that was under contract at Universal going back to the 50s and had great Cary Grant stories, and just being a contract player and the various big stars that he got a chance to do supporting roles with. Not to mention his bionic years as well. Could not have been a nicer guy. I got an autograph picture with him, and it's one of my favorite San Diego mementos. So, and I know George Lazenby. I missed him, but he was there one year, just at a booth, and didn't even have a panel. But there's one of the great James Bonds, and then granted, people might say, well, maybe not one of the great ones, maybe the B level. He's James Bond, man. It was pretty cool that he was just there hanging out, doing signings. So you never
Whatever
know.
you think of George Lazenby, you can always say, I'm James Bond and you're not. So
that's true. Hey, man. Well, that and, I was saying, I don't know what your feelings are on this. As we hear that they're pushing back the next Indiana Jones movie, I keep saying before they recast a brand new young actor to play Indiana Jones, they really have to let Sean Patrick Flannery do one movie because he was, young teen Indiana Jones in the TV series. And Art Baltazar once went up to him and said, hey, man, Boondock Saints is great, but let's not forget, you are Indiana Jones. And he's like, you're damn right, I'm Indiana Jones. And it's like, hey, save money. Give that guy $5 million to make the movie. And you've got it legitimizes the TV show that much more, I think, if you have an adult Sean Patrick Flannery doing one indie movie.
I'd go see it. Yeah. Well, this is another kind of deep cut pro tip on navigating Comic-Con is read the booth signing stuff carefully, because one time I'm walking around and I spot Grant Morrison at this tiny little indie comics booth. He was there doing a signing as a favor for some creator that was a friend of his. Usually the line for Grant Morrison is around the block, and he's sitting there all by himself. And I walked up and we ended up chatting for 15 or 20 minutes. He did a sketch for me in my sketchbook. So,
that's great. Wow.
People go flipping through my sketchbook and they say, who drew this? Because you can't read his signature. It said it was Grant Morrison. So
that's fantastic. That's, and that happened with me and Darwin Cook a couple times in the past as well, or he'd be at a smaller booth. And I had the opportunity to, really get some face-to-face time with him. Great guy. And, no, you're right about that. So, well, again, Rob, this is why I'm having you on to talk about these kind of tips and stuff. Now, you're in a book of essays, right, about an interesting spin on superheroes.
Yeah. So this just came out today. Actually, today is the first day. I still don't have my copy yet, but I'm told it's really cool. It's called Superheroes and Economics: the Shadowy World of Capes, Masks, and Invisible Hands. And I'm listed as the co-editor of this book, which is an act of charity by the real mastermind behind it, who is Professor Brian O'Rourke of Robert Morris University in Pittsburgh. And he's an economist, and he's been teaching economics at the university level for a while, and he has found that it's really helpful, for students these days to have relatable examples. And so he's been using examples out of comics and superhero movies to make points about different things. So you're talking about entrepreneurship. Well, there's Tony Stark, and he's an entrepreneur, and this is how entrepreneurs make their money, and these are the challenges that they face, or stuff like that. So he decided to do a collection of essays where real economists look at the financial problems of different superheroes and apply like actual economics to them. So it's like, there's stories about, how does Spider-Man pay the rent? And so Captain America was frozen in ice for 80 years since World War II. How's his portfolio doing? And, it's an opportunity to look at, here's how economic growth works. And if you put money in the bank in 1945, it's going to be worth a lot more money in 2018, but there's different ways that you can make money. And, it's all this stuff. So I'm not an economist, but I thought this is a fun project. So I ended up contributing a piece on economic realism in Alan Moore in his work. So I looked at Watchmen, Miracle Man, and V for Vendetta, which are three of his earlier works, where he really created these very real worlds to put superheroes in. And he was one of the first guys to do that, to really go through and think systematically, what would the world look like if there was actually superheroes? So, of course, Watchmen is the most famous example, where you've got all of these politics and
Adrian Veidt.
Yeah, Adrian Veidt is.
He has the nostalgia company that makes the sense, and also, you tell me. You're the one who probably explored really all the different areas that Ozymandias had in his portfolio.
So that's actually the pivotal scene. That's one of the ones that I look at, because it's his superpower is that he can he's so smart that he can put all the pieces together. At the time that Alan Moore was writing that in the early 80s, less than 100 miles from where Alan Moore was writing in London, there was a group of economists that were putting together a modeling methodology called scenario planning, which is doing exactly what Moore was doing in a fictional world, which is sort of extrapolating from the world that we're in right now and posing a whole bunch of what ifs, and then sort of coming up with like, so, you know, what are the good bets that we should be looking at in a whole bunch of different variable futures. So I drew a parallel, because this is a method that I use in my business stuff a lot. In Comic-Con and the Business of Pop Culture, for example, at the end, when I looked at the sort of possible futures of the comics industry from the vantage point of 2012, looking out into the future, where would we be going? And I was using a example of that kind of planning. So it was very interesting. You know, you read Watchmen, there's a lot of stuff going on. One of the things that's going on is the world building that Moore was doing in that book, and also in Miracle Man is some interesting examples of the same sort of things that economists do to try and figure out what the, you know, if we do this, then what are the things we can expect to happen?
Yeah, the impact. And again, when you include superheroes into a real culture structure, yeah, what are some of the things? Well, God, you can, I'm sure, go to top 10 as well, and there's all those great billboards of, you know, the eye candy that you get in a lot of what Gene Ha put on the page, and I'm sure through Alan's instruction as well. But, you know, songs coming from the radio that are superhero related, and products that are created that clearly, you know, touch on a superhero facet in some way. No, I love that. And also, you know, it's funny you say that about how economists do it to see where business trends are going. Brad Meltzer's been on before, and certainly from a security standpoint, the government is constantly running those kinds of what-if scenarios of possible terrorist attacks or any sort of attacks. And I know Meltzer's been involved with those before. Bendis has been involved with those before. And it is interesting that they go to the comic book people, knowing that they have good imaginations and can kind of like figure out where these things might actually go.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. So the book is a collection of all of these essays, and they're really pretty interesting. There's a really cool one. One of my favorite ones in the book is a guy looked at African economic development post-colonialism and compared it with Wakanda, and talking about all of the ways that, like, Wakanda departs from the norm of African economic development and politics and stuff like that, is a very very smart piece, interesting work. The problem is, honestly, I would love for people to read this, but it's out from the publisher is Routledge, which is an academic press, and it's not really priced to fly off the shelves, let's say. I think the paper...
For consumers. It's you were telling me this when we were talking last week.
So again, not to discourage anybody, it's $40 for the paperback, and it's like $120 for the hardcover. And those are meant for libraries and academic institutions and stuff like that. I hope they make a trade edition available. I hope they maybe drop the price on the digital version, because I'm proud of the work. It's good stuff. But it's again, it's a little bit of a departure from the business. It was kind of fun to get into a different kind of writing about comics. But it's just kind of a cool thing, and I get my name on the spine of a book, which is
that never sucks. Exactly. Well, you know, in mentioning the university presses and those kinds of academic publications, that is another facet of panels that happens at San Diego, that if you're really not looking for that, you're really missing some interesting panels. And I know you and I have been in the room with like maybe 20 people, and they've got like 4 people on a panel up there talking about comics that you maybe have never heard of. And sometimes they're fascinating stories. I remember one, and I'm pretty sure you were in the audience too. I don't remember the name of the comic, but essentially it was a comic that was created for post-World War II Japan to normalize American-Japanese relations. And it really was this kind of positive propaganda cartoon, again, meant to, you know, ease relations in this post-war period. And it was fascinating. And this academic was just talking about who drew it and why, and had examples and stuff. Or there was a great one, and I can't remember the name of the creator of Crazy Cats and Ignatz.
Oh, Harriman, yes.
Harriman, a wonderful talk about Harriman. I remember, too, a wonderful one about black comic creators, going back to people like Matt Baker and the like of the 40s.
Yep.
Matt Baker, for people who don't know, was one of the great artists that did the original Phantom Girl 1940s comics, among other works that he did. And, yeah, it's constantly really interesting stuff. Or I'm sure 10 Cent Archie came in your point of view when it was out a couple years ago. A great study of Archie from the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
And maybe it was purely the 1960s. But it was great, and it just, again, these wonderful kind of, pieces that academics do to kind of just take a look at pop culture through the transom of comics. And they're fascinating. They're really, really interesting pieces.
Well, the cool thing is that the academic study of comics has so many different applications. I mean, I teach at the University of Washington. I teach a class in comics as media, and it's talking about comics as like a storytelling platform and how comic stories translate to other, to film and TV and video games and all of this other stuff. But starts with what makes comics and all of that. So that's in the communications department. A lot of this stuff is in comp lit, or it's in American studies, or queer studies, gender studies, all of this stuff.
Sure.
The cool thing about the economics book is that this is one of the first ones that's in social sciences. So economics really, this is new territory for them. So we'll see how the profession embraces that sort of hybrid. But one of the other cool things I do is that there's a professor who he has students from all over the country that sign up for this program, and they come to Comic-Con to do anthropological ethnography studies of different facets of Comic-Con. So I meet with them on because they read my book on Comic-Con, the business of pop culture, as kind of a orientation. And then I have a Q&A with them on usually on Wednesday afternoon. I meet with the professor and the whole group, and then they present their research on Sunday afternoon. I always love going to that panel.
Oh wow!
Because
that's cool. I haven't done that before. Very cool.
They all come out and they present the results of their findings, and it's always very interesting. It's like they talk to, gender bending cosplayers, or people waiting in line for the Outlander panel, or they have their thing that they're looking at, and they contribute to our understanding of it. So
that's really great. Now, mentioning that and also mentioning your book, I saw a couple weeks ago you finally went to one of those Ace comic panels that the Seamus brothers have been putting on. The former guys who were behind Wizard Magazine and also the Wizard conventions. Yes. They are no longer part of the Wizard team. They've now created their own new kind of, I'm putting in air quotes, Comic-Con. It really isn't. It's more about, it seems, the celebrity autograph shows that some of these other conventions, while they call themselves Comic-Cons, and there might be an artist alley or something, the main focus seems to be more about the photo ops with the Justice League or, the cast of Twilight or whatever. So tell me your experience at one of these Asian.
So this is one where I have to really step back because, like you, I'm inclined to kind of give the side eye to that side of the business because it's not my kind of thing. I'm not that interested in the celebrities and the autographs and everything, but lots of people are. And
sure.
And one thing I got to take my hat off to the Seamus brothers is they really understand the market, and they understand a certain kind of customer and what these folks want, and they put together this show that really delivered the goods. And what I was talking to Gareb about it, he kept saying this is a superhero convention, not a comic convention. They call it a Comic-Con as part of their branding, which they may want to reconsider that for a couple of reasons, but fundamentally, it's a superhero show. So they had a bunch of the folks from the Avengers. They had the Tom Holland Spider-Man. They had Paul Bettany, and they had a few. Their big guys, Chris Evans and Hemsworth, couldn't make it, but they had a really good lineup for a first year show. They filled their venue in Seattle. They didn't overload the dealers' room, so they had maybe 100 exhibitors, maybe 80. And of those, 5 or 6 people selling comics, 5 or 6 people selling toys, a couple of artists, a couple of print people, stuff like that. So they weren't all competing with each other. And as I was going through that, all the dealers made money, much more money than they thought they were going to make. Some of them said they did better at this show than they did at Emerald City, which is a much more comics-oriented show.
Absolutely.
Also much larger, also lots more stuff going on there to do your money. Also, the format of their convention was very interesting. Is you walk in, and instead of you walk in the dealer's room and then the programs are upstairs, here you walked into the main auditorium, and they had enough seating in this room, something like 11 or 12,000 people they could fit, so that anybody that was at the show, anybody that bought a ticket could get a seat. You don't have to line up. If you want to see Tom Holland, here he is. So he's in the main room, and then you have to leave the main room, and that's where the dealers are. So I thought that was very interesting, and they had a pretty for a show that wasn't focused on like the art and publishing aspect really at all. They had pretty good representation of artists, and they had art programs they had stuff for kids. They had community stuff. I mean, it was interesting. It was a little more, as I said, not focused on the stuff that personally turns me on, but the attendees that I talked to were having a good time. They sold a lot of tickets. It was transactional, but that's what people wanted. And they were very shrewd about identifying Seattle as the market for this, because even though we have 8 or 9 gigantic between Emerald City and PAX and SakuraCon, we've got it covered for pop culture. Emerald City basically said, we have a great show. We don't need the tip-top celebrity people. They have a few. They have good people that come there, but that's not the focus of that show. So Ace says, fine, we'll do a celebrity show. And so everybody's happy. If you don't like Ace, go to Emerald City, go to Jet City, go to Renton Comic-Con, go to one of these smaller shows where there was a show up here where they had Howard Chaykin and Steranko and Neil Adams at the show Bellingham Comic-Con or something like that. And great lineup of talent. You were telling me before you came on the air that there's a show in Connecticut coming up, right?
That's right. Instead of San Diego, I'm doing Terrificon. People probably heard the commercial at the beginning of the podcast. And, it's at Mohegan Sun, the Native American casino out there. And Mike Barr, Jim Starlin, Roy Thomas, David Michelini. I'm just going off names off the top of my head. Don McGregor. And, great classic comic creators, along with C.B. Cebulski, Charles Soule, Nick Spencer, Mike Norton, Tim Seeley, so great contemporary names, Ryan Stegman. So it's a nice mix of comic book people. And they do have an autograph section, and Henry Winkler's going to be there, and Sam Jones, the woman who plays Mantis in the Guardians movies.
Cool.
They have it's a good mix. Yeah. It leans more on classic comic book creators, just like you said with Steranko and Howard and Neil and stuff. But it's a great combination. Christopher Priest is also going to be there, and that's cool. Well, I had a question about the Ace show. So when you say there's 12,000 seats, so Tom Holland does a panel and in the main room, I'm assuming, and like you said, there's enough seats to accommodate everybody. Is it like that?
It is
happening in the main room, it's kind of on the PA and everything.
Yeah, and they had Kevin Smith there as the MC, and he was running the panels, and for the most part, he was pretty good. There was one of the panels that kind of went off the rails because honestly, people in the audience were asking questions that were idiotic and embarrassing, even by Comic-Con standards. For celebrity panels, it was pretty rough. So, but they had Tom Hiddleston was there. I mean, it was a good lineup. Cool. And again, it's like, so if you're into that stuff, there's Ace Comic Con. There's the other guy from Wizard, Macaluso, has his own company that's doing those kind of shows.
I didn't know that. How about Steve Amell's shows that he's been doing? Isn't it Heroes and Villains? Isn't that Arrow from the television show, for people who don't know what I'm talking about, which is probably
there's that. There's the Walker Stalker. I mean, there's all of this stuff. But then if that was the only thing that was going on in the convention space, people would be justifiably upset. And there was a big to-do earlier this year when it was announced that Bud Plant, the great art book dealer, will for the first time in 49 years not be exhibiting at San Diego Comic-Con.
heartbreaking. I always go to Bud Plant's, area because he always has these great books that only he still has and distributes. Go on.
Yeah, and me too. And I'm personally bummed about that because it's one less place that I'm going to shop. But it's not like, I mean, Bud is still with us. He's still in business. Yes. And there are much better places. If you like that kind of stuff, he sets up at shows where his – they'll have 1/100th of the attendance, but he'll get 10 times the people because they're his customers. And so, if you go to, and I use this term with all due affection, these old fart Comic Cons for people like us, and they're selling comic books, and they got the talent that we remember from the 70s and 80s when we were reading comics and stuff like that. They're much more approachable. They're much more low key. They're cheaper. And if that's the experience you want, then that experience is available in spades right now. It's not like there's only one game in town or even, 50 games in town. There's like thousands. So
it's interesting. Go on.
Yeah. I mean, it's San Diego Comic-Con is a special case. And I tell people this is what happens when we've won the argument. For, 30 years we've been saying, God damn it, people need to pay attention to comic books because the stories are great and these characters are good, and if people just give them a chance, great, we win. Everybody loves comics. Everybody loves superheroes now. This is our prize. We get San Diego Comic-Con as it is today, which fortunately still has plenty to offer for everybody. So, but they're contemporary, and contemporary comics culture is at least part that, and some would say mostly that.
I've asked you this before regarding your book because you kind of had 4 different scenarios for the future, as I remember, from your book in 2012. It seems like we are, based on what we're talking about right now, at kind of a combination of a couple of the future scenarios that you laid out, and I wonder if you wanted to articulate.
Yeah, so
you think we are right now.
Yeah, so there were basically in the book I had sort of 4 scenarios. One of one set of scenarios where it was the big companies that are driving the industry, and there was sort of a good scenario of that, which is where comics become all media, which I called Endless Summer, which is pretty much where we're at right now. And that predicted a lot of consolidation, and it said stuff like crazy predictions, like Amazon was going to buy Comixology, and the Marvel Disney thing was going to generate billions and billions of dollars, and AT&T was going to buy Warner Brothers and all this stuff, and lo and behold, that's the future that we're living in for most of the media world. There was also one in there called Infinite Crisis, which talked about basically the collapse of the comics publishing industry and the direct market, because the direct market couldn't find a way out of the box that it was in, and that was going to kind of drag down everything with it. And that is kind of, I mean, I'm hoping the publishers are getting smarter about where they're putting their books. This DC and Walmart thing is very interesting, but it's not the most interesting thing DC is doing is their new lines for young readers and
Absolutely. Yes, the Zoom line, and I forget the other line that they're doing. Yes, and a couple of my friends are involved with that. Art and Franco are doing a Superman of Smallville book that is clearly geared towards tweens, to 10 to 12-year-olds and everything. And,
the secret is that they're not treating this as like the Ghetto or the Training Wheels comics. They're putting A-list talent on these books. They're making books that any reader would want to read, which honestly they should have been doing 10 years ago, but better late than never. But I mean, sure. And that's where the action is. So that's good for them. I think Marvel is trying to do some of the same stuff, and they have sort of selected titles, and they have different channel strategies for Devil Dinosaur and Moon Girl versus their other stuff, right. That kind of thing. So I think I think Marvel institutionally is a little more resistant to. They've got their brand. Their brand is for guys from their mid-teens to their late 20s, and anybody else that wants to read Marvel Comics is welcome, but that's like they've got their audience that they own, and that's so all right, fine. But they're trying to get more out of it, but the direct market is in bad shape, and there's a lot of stuff going on with that, and I hope every year it looks like it's do or die time So I hope that happens. So those two are coming true at the same time. The two other scenarios were around sort of bottom up. One of them sort of, with comics as literature. And in the book, I talk about like everything else has collapsed and that's all there is left is comics as literature. Well, that hasn't happened because comics as literature has happened as its own thing. And that was also comics and museums and all this other stuff that we're talking about. Sure. And last year, I was putting together my top 10 list for best comics of the year. I could have had 20. I could have had 25.
Of course.
Any book that came out in 2017 that was in the top 25 graphic novels could have been top 10 any other year. So we're in a real renaissance for that. And then the last one was sort of comics, sort of this internationalization of comics. And that's happening too, but it's not being a real market force. It's just creatively there's a lot more talent coming from elsewhere in the world and getting their voices out there. And that's good too. So it's like pieces of them are all coming together. But I think the predominant mode that we're in right now is that endless summer.
It's going to be interesting to see, and you mentioned that Amazon might get in the business, that instead, Netflix has gotten into comic business specifically with Mark Miller. Mm-hmm. And Mark released his first Netflix comic book. It's going to be interesting to see how that relationship develops. And really, it's set in stone. I mean, they've bought these IPs, I think 15 or 17 of Mark's different IPs that he's created that aren't Wanted and Kick-Ass and Kingsman that have already been taken by other studios, but Jupiter's Circle is in the works, and Chrononauts I think is in the works. I mean, it's really interesting, and it's going to be fun to see how that stuff works hand in hand, both as comic books and also potential TV and movie properties. And then of course Kirkman, I guess. Actually, Amazon is getting in the business a little bit with Kirkman and his future development deals. Yeah,
it remains to be seen. I feel like the market is very crowded with these, like Amazon has their own imprint called Jet City. Has anybody ever seen these comics on the shelf?
I didn't know that. Wow, I've seen, Jimmy Palmiotti made me aware of Jet City a few years ago. I had no idea that was under Amazon's umbrella.
That's Amazon. No, that was theirs from the start.
Always.
Then there's Legendary Comics. Has anybody seen these books on the shelves? I mean, it's like they have trade books.
That's a good point.
I mean, Frank Miller and Bob Schrecken, good people are involved in that. But it feels like every week I'm getting an announcement of a new imprint that's coming that has some really exciting stuff and A-list talent and all this. Who's going to buy these books? How are they going to get to market? It's.
I do think in the cases of Kirkman and Mark Miller, given the amount of properties they have, because
Kirkman and Mark Miller are separate issues. Those guys know how to move product in 9-figure numbers, but there's not that many of these. I mean.
Well, yeah. No, but you're right, and it is interesting. And also, I just had him on a couple weeks ago, Bendis.
He's the other one.
His deal with DC is really interesting. And I mean, he really went into detail about how, Dan DiDio wants him to do Jinx World books. Of course he wants him to do mainline DC Universe books as well. But, I mean, verbatim from Bendis' mouth, he's like, DiDio's telling me, hey, I really think you kind of have been neglecting your creator-owned comics. What can I do to facilitate you making these books? And, Brian is like, well, I guess I just got twice as busy because I'm not going to have this opportunity handed to me again. And that's why it's an interesting time. And certainly I know you're going to be watching as well. I mean, this is the benefit of having this podcast, is seeing these companies, experiment. And, I mean, ultimately, the other thing that kind of drives me crazy from an editorial standpoint is that some readers are like, just make good comics. I don't need you to make comics for other people. And it's like, well, yeah, they're doing that. And maybe it's a good idea to get more people in. Tom King just said cradle to the grave is how he described DC's ambitions with creating these other YA platforms and everything. And it's like, yeah, let's get some more new readers. And certainly the Walmart deal is part of that as well.
I don't like to contemplate where I am on that continuum, but more
don't worry, we got decades.
More power to him, and I hope it works out, and at the very least, it's putting some money in creators' pockets, and that's an unvarnished good thing whenever it happens. So wherever these new publishers or existing publishers are getting their dollars from, I hope they keep coming.
I agree, man. Any other thoughts as we're wrapping up? I think we're at a good point where we can put a button on it there.
Yeah, for the two listeners who are still with us here.
No. Rob, I'm telling you, and my listeners, they trust me in terms of where I want to take these conversations. And truly, this week in particular is all about the not obvious nook and cranny kind of things that are happening at Comic-Con. And that's why I wanted to talk to you, because I knew you were one of those people that, along with your own interests of what you're looking for and stuff, was going to be on some of these panels. And truly, I know it's a segmented audience, but I think it's that's what makes San Diego great. That they do still cater to the small voices and this level of comic interest, along with the Hall H stuff.
Well, absolutely. Well, I'm going to miss you there, John. But if any of your listeners are out there, once again, the press panel Thursday at 10:30, the museum panel Thursday at 4, the alt anthology Saturday at 4:30, and Jason Lutz Sunday at noon. And if you happen to see me around the floor and want to chat, I'm happy to meet people and talk about all this stuff. As you can tell, I love talking about it.
Attaboy. Well, and also from a online standpoint, your weekly columns at Forbes, also ICV2.
Correct. And
go on.
I tweet out about all the stuff that I'm doing at Rob Salk, ROBSALK, on Twitter. That's the main place to look for me. And yeah, I've got a bunch of stuff. I've got a big piece in Publishers Weekly coming in August. So
cool.
Yeah, it'll be fun stuff.
Excellent, man. Now keep up the good work, man. I'm glad that we have someone like yourself that's covering the geek media from this point of view. And I think you always provide good information and great coverage. And I'm glad you're always willing to come back and have a new chat with me. So look forward to the next one.
Likewise, I'm sure. Take it easy, bud.
That's our buddy Rob Salkowitz. I hope you enjoyed it. Before we go, I was just recently on some Chicago radio. I wasn't able to go to San Diego Comic-Con, but here's a panel of sorts that I did on live Chicago radio just this past Wednesday. I went back to my old stomping grounds of the sports radio station in Chicago, The Score. I spent 9 years there as a producer and then as a reporter and production director of the place. A couple of the best years of my time there at The Score were spent working directly with two of my good friends who are wonderful sports journalists, Dan McNeil and Terry Boers. Dan McNeil came from Indiana, did a lot of Chicago radio before the forming of The Score, and Dan was one of the original first hosts, as was Terry Boers. Terry Boers' background, he came from the Chicago Sun-Times. He also worked for Detroit newspapers before he came to Chicago, but he is a guy who was raised here in Chicago. Great journalist, over 30 years of newspaper journalism. Came on the radio, did 25 years of radio, just retired at the beginning of last year, and came back for a reunion show with Dan, and they asked me to be a guest, so I spent about 12 minutes with them. That's what I'm going to present to you right now. But a little context before we get started. First, I spent about half a year on the morning show on The Score, working with Chicago Bull Norm Van Leer and Chicago Bear Doug Buffone. Great guys, very, very funny. Neither of them were very good at as far as leading a radio show, and they asked me to come on and just do comedy bits and be there with them as a second banana. And as I say, nobody was driving the car, nobody was driving the show, and things didn't work out. Never against those guys; they were terrific, but management and I disagreed with the direction of the show, so I left. And we have a story about that. And just to give you, again, context when we start talking about them in the middle of the conversation. Also, we start things off with a great soundbite from Bears coach Mike Ditka. We were doing the Mike Ditka weekly Chicago Bears show, and it starts off with Terry asking a question of Ditka, and Ditka basically said, "Hey, who are you trying to bullshit here?" And he used the phrase, "Who you crappin'?" Well, "Who you crappin'" became this huge Score bit weekly that started with McNeil and Boers, continued after they were separated for no bad reasons, but just to spread the brand around. And then Terry had a new co-host, Dan Bernstein. They continued Who You Crappin' well up until Terry's retirement in 2017. So great feature on The Score, and callers would call in and just point out sports people who were lying And that's kind of the point of this initial soundbite that ushers in our conversation. So Dan McNeil, Terry Boers, and yours truly, recently on WSCR Radio on Wednesday. I hope you enjoy this portion of Word Balloon.
One of the things, Mike, that's been pointed out over the course of today and last night after the game, that there wasn't much fire in you, and you sort of stood up before the media and said, well, this is the way it is. Are you resigned to this fate?
Well, you're the same guy that wrote about me when I did have the fire, that was the wrong thing to do. So who you crapping?
Well, I'm just asking.
Don't crap me now. No.
Nah, don't crap me. Fall of 1992. I was fist pumping, driving down the Kennedy. We got a segment.
Like I said yesterday, it wasn't stunning to me because that's how he always treated me, so I didn't even catch it right away. I had him more than half tuned out, if that's possible. I really wasn't listening to anything he said, so I didn't catch it. You caught it. That's what people want to say. You caught it more than I did. To me, it was just another day at the office. Dope. Okay.
Gang, we suck, gang. Chewing his gum. We suck, gang.
This is John Suntress, Shaky Suntress,
Hi.
who used to produce our show.
Hi, everybody. Oh, boy.
Part of the ill-fated morning show with the late Norm Van Leer and the late Doug Buffone.
I'll tell you what. Norm, he's coming back every Sunday into Monday on the red eye from L.A., so a lot of times he'd miss the game. And, it's a Bears Monday. So literally that's all we're talking about for 4 hours. He's like, so what happened with the game yesterday, baby? And we're like, Norm, you realize we're going to be talking about it for the next 4 hours. Don't worry, baby, I'm going to fake it. And we're like, oh, Chooch, don't worry about a thing, Chooch. It's all going to be fine. Everything's going to be fine.
That's right. Doug used to call you Chooch.
I was whacked out on Xanax every day, I'm telling you. I was like Janine Garofalo on Saturday Night Live. I'm like, get me the hell out of here. Good Lord. Who's driving? Nobody's driving. That's why it's a fun show.
See, yes, there's Ron Gleason in a nutshell. There's Gilligan.
When the inmates ran the asylum, the golden age of the score. It's the total truth.
I know. I don't dispute that. I know that.
Did you guys talk about the first of all, George would do his news updates in this tiny little booth that literally was maybe the size of a phone booth and a half. And in between reports, I would cut up the the openings and stuff and take highlights. Well, we'd be yelling back and forth, and then the monsters would be late to the update, so that would cut into my production time.
Monsters were late?
Exactly. What are the odds? Exactly. And I'm like, so everyone's screaming, and at one point it's me, George, and Jiggets. And Harvey Wells, our station manager, is like, hey, you want to keep it down? People are trying to work here. And Jiggets went nuts. He's like, well, we're all stuck in here like it's one phone booth and you got 5 guys. He's like, we're rats in a cage, Harvey. We're rats in a cage. So for like the next 5 hours, every time we see Harvey, we're rats in a cage, Harvey. That's awesome.
Harvey was great at getting that refrigerator cleaned out by 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon, though. Man, I never saw an executive with more skills than that. When he get this stuff out of here by 3 o'clock on Friday, he meant it. He'd toss it.
Yeah. Well, as I said yesterday, too, he's the only one that would read Murph's notes.
Hey, I got something here. Listen, I got like 2 legal pads full of notes. I just wanted to, get this. First of all, nobody's listening to me as far as the staff goes. I love Murph. I know. I read your chapter. Good Lord. Wow, man. You were saving it up, weren't you? You knew that book?
He teed him up yesterday for a good 15 minutes as well.
I know. I got to listen to the highlights, man. I missed Judd yesterday. I'm so bummed. I missed Judd. We had fun. I think I did your guys' show for like 2 years. And then afterwards, I shifted to production. But it was so much fun. We'd laugh every day. Truly. And honestly, I think one day Dan got mad. He's like, don't excuse me.
I should get that T-shirt. Don't excuse me.
One time.
You did have an excuse for something, though.
One day, Dan got Ron mad. And he wanted him out of there, and he was going to take over co-hosting with Terry. And he points at Dan, and he goes like this. He's like, you want to take over? And he goes, yeah. He goes, fine. Hope you read the papers. And he throws up his headphones and walks out. And we feel bad for Dan, but we can't help it. We're all laughing, man. We were crying.
Well, the Goose was a chotch, wasn't he? I like Ron a lot on a personal level. I think he's a wonderful guy, but he was in over his head.
Well, again, the inmates ran the asylum.
That's right. He didn't have a very strong strong will.
You know, I started working at BBM. I've been working there for about 15 months now, doing overnight traffic. And
because it's so glamorous,
it's fun. Oh, you know, it's great. BBM really is like the score elephant graveyard. Because I'm there, George is there, Kerner is there,
save me a desk,
Bartosh is there. It's so funny, and we are. It's like, oh, how you doing? I'm fine. How are you? Chief Lousy shirt. George shows up every day, kind of, you know, maintaining the record of having the most interesting prints on Oxford shirts you've ever seen. That's why he came in with this weird Native American print that looked like it was probably like 12 years old from a Sears catalog. And I started calling him Chief Lousy shirt after that.
I don't think you can do that anymore, can you?
Humpty Grumpty.
I said Native American.
Humpty Grumpty. It occurred to me yesterday as I was thinking about, with you coming on today, that I once dubbed you Humpty Grumpty.
That's true.
Yeah,
and an idiot.
You were in a bad mood a lot of the time.
You know, my neutral face is a scowl.
You do have bitch face.
I do have bitch face.
Resting bitch face.
It's true. But yeah, Dan would be like, you know, I talk about some rerun I saw. Get Smart the other night. Oh my God, Dick Odia. And he's like, you know, Shaky, you're a vidiot. You know that? I'm like, all right, I'm cool with that. God, by the way, The Rock, a lot of charisma, man. You got to admit it. He's a likable guy.
What he's
and that's
doing.
why
he plays the game well. I don't get the impression his waters run real deep, but he plays the part
his bankroll
well.
does.
Honestly, a really good dramatic movie he made called Snitch with Barry
really
Pepper.
Good. Yep, I saw it. Yep.
Yeah,
I like Barry Pepper. Sherry likes Barry
He
Pepper.
goes undercover to like nab a drug dealer. And it's a really good. I swear to God,
and he's not even rockish.
No, that's
what
I mean. It was
not
legitimately The Rock doing a dramatic role.
Because you kept waiting for the pick up the semi and throw it, but he doesn't.
Never raised the eyebrow. I also liked the Poor Man's In-Laws that he did with Kevin Hart. Central Intelligence, I want to say.
Central Intelligence,
right?
yeah.
And that was kind of fun. And it was clearly like an In-Laws kind of, you know, serpentine shell.
Kevin Hart's due, isn't he? He hasn't made a movie in a month or two, right?
Yeah, well, didn't he have? Well, I know he had like adultery issues, and maybe that kind of submarine, you know, the career for like 5 seconds. Yeah, he'll be back. He's funny. He's good. I like him. That's a good movie.
This visit with Shaky Suntress is brought to you by Orkin. Every home is unique.
Appropriate.
That's why Orkin relies.
We used to go through this every day with this guy.
That's why Orkin relies on the latest science to get rid of pests, because pests hate science. Visit Orkin.com today. Orkin, pest control down to a science. I met for the second, I guess you only meet someone once technically, but for the second time in my life, just a few years ago, I spent about 30 minutes with Mike Tyson.
Yes.
And
kindred spirits.
And I think that's why we got along so well, on and off the air. He's talking about his time in the joint in Indiana, and I told him I live in Northwest Indiana. Is that anywhere near Hammond? And I'm like, yeah. I was born in Hammond. I grew up in a neighboring town, Highland. Those MFers from Hammond are crazy. Do me a favor, say that on the backside, but lose the F-bomb. And he did. But I know this sounds bad, but he's a wonderful guy. He's fun to be around. I was shocked how much I enjoyed his company.
Life hit him hard, man. I mean, you know, and not to get sad, but truly, obviously losing a kid obviously probably messed him up. And I think with age comes perspective, and I think he is grateful given where his career went and went from being one of the most loved guys coming up to one of the most hated guys even before the ear biting with Holyfield. And, you know, now I think
wanted to eat his children. You do it better than I do.
Yes,
Give me
it's
some
true.
Mike.
Listen, my one-man play has really taken off, and I'm considering doing other one-man plays. I'm going to do an evening with Mark Twain. I think that's really going to be successful. My days on the Mississippi River as a steamboat captain. Who doesn't want to hear me talk? The day that Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer, and I were whitewashing a fence. So, you know, a musical, Don King and I think will be a very good one. I'm looking forward to that.
Not Mike, you still got your pet lion.
No, the zoning people in Vegas made me get rid of the lion. It was sad because, you know, I'd take him over to Siegfried and Roy's and we'd frolic. And it was fun. It was very born free. So
he does these
a shame.
impersonations. I swear, you would think it was the real people.
I mean, for most of his life, he never spoke a word that meant anything. And then at the end, he started actually become more of a person after Buffet Douglas got him. Because, I mean, he, you know, oh, my God. But I love to cover his fights.
Oh, God, yes.
Nothing
Yeah,
better.
man. And me too.
That's why you wear the boxing shoes.
That's exactly right. Oh, yeah.
I
I was at the Tyson-Bruno rematch at the MGM Grand, and that was great. And I was at the press conference for the rematch with Razor Ruddock. And I asked him, I'm like, hey, everybody really wants to see you fight Buster Douglas again. He's like,
Buster Douglas is a dog. He doesn't deserve to fight me again.
And the guy from Showtime, the CEO, is like, well, Mike, we ran a survey. And actually, people really do want to see you rematch Buster. And Don King, well, if he's going to come, he better be ready to take a lot less money. So Don, it is such a weird, different boxing world today because Don King, they're all in their 80s now. I mean, Bob Arum is still a force. And God, he's been showing great fights on ESPN. But it's weird. It's just like...
Yeah. No one cares about boxing.
Yeah, that's true.
You're right.
It's true. MMA.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right.
This generation is not
interested
in boxing.
And it's a shame because, honestly, the competition has really gotten great. They finally realized don't hold for 12 rounds, maybe actually fight each other. And you got that Vasily Lomachenko and...
What's that?
Throw some punches.
Yes, for God's sake. And listen, by the way, Deontay Wilder, you talk a good game for fighting nothing but somnambulists and mummies, because I've yet to see you actually. You fought one Cuban that used to back up Desi Arnaz back in the I Love Lucy days that actually knew how to fight. And he slapped you silly. You didn't know where the hell you were. And yet you're going to beat me? My reputation can take you right now.
Our conversation with Not Mike Tyson brought to you by Aaron Hills Golf Course in Southeast Wisconsin. Championship golf on a landscape shaped by glaciers. For a different experience, make Aaron Hills your next golf destination. Play, stay, eat, and meet at the site of the 2017 U.S. Open Business or Pleasure, aaronhills.com. ERIN Hills.com. Shaky, it's great to see you. Thanks for stopping
always
by.
a pleasure.
Give it up for our guy, John Suntress.
I miss you both.
Love you.
Love you.
Yep.
Dan Patrick joins us in an hour. Hoiberg at 4 o'clock. And Dave Wanstead here at 5. It's McNeil and Boris on Sports Radio 670 The Score.
There you go. Much like my boxing interviews, I keep kicking around the idea of talking to some of my friends in Chicago sports radio history because I really felt like something really special happened starting in the 90s with Chicago sports radio. Right behind WFAN, we went on the air. That's the New York station. There was also, I think, St. Paul, Minneapolis also started a sports station around the same time we did. And we were one of the first sports stations in the country to do 24 hours of sports talk. We were certainly the first Chicago station to do it. And there's just a lot of my friends that I think really helped shape what sports radio has become. So in the future here on Word Balloon, you might hear Dan McNeil and Terry Boers one-on-one with me, some of my other friends in sports broadcasting, to talk about, what they did and my small role. I always like to say I was a reporter and a weekend host and certainly a producer, kind of a spear carrier, if you will, if you put it in theater terms. They were the Oliviers. They were the guys on the front stage. I was one of the supporting guys, but I was there. And I kind of think a lot of magic happened as far as radio goes in those broadcast years. So I hope you enjoyed that little piece. As we wrap up today's Word Balloon, thank you very much, League of Word Balloon listeners, for your continued support of this show. And we've got one more Word Balloon Unconventional coming your way at the end of the weekend. This would reflect the after-hours conversation that goes on at conventions. And it's a fun talk with our good friend Sal Abenati. He reps wonderful artists like Bill Sienkiewicz and Alex Ross, and he is manning the Alex Ross booth at Comic-Con this weekend. You should go over there because it's beautiful, and it's a gallery presentation of wonderful Alex Ross art. Bill Sienkiewicz has a similar gallery presentation of his art as well. It's gorgeous, and I highly recommend you checking him out because they're both there. Alex isn't there, but Bill is there at his booth, willing to autograph and shake your hand and meet you and talk about his work with you. Sal and Justin and our buddies Chris as well run the booth for Alex Ross art. It's always an amazing presentation as well. Alex and Chip are there, at the convention. They are promoting the new Marvel book that they're going to be putting together, and that's among the things that we discussed in our conversation with Sal. It's coming out later this year, but it's going to be a beautiful presentation of all of Alex's art, at Marvel, and Chip is doing the words of the book. Pretty neat stuff. So look forward to that conversation coming up before the weekend's over right here on Word Balloon. Thanks for listening today. Look forward to talking to you with another Word Balloon Unconventional to wrap up the week. Until next time, Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions, copyright 2018.